Life magazine, August 23rd, 1963. The total line of the march will measure only about 1 mile, from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. No one any longer doubts that at least 100,000 marchers will be swarming over this route. And there are some who fear that 250,000 people will try to crush their way into the Capitol and turn the demonstration into chaos. How the event comes off, whether it explodes into violence and sets back the cause of civil rights, or proceeds smoothly and peacefully as hoped, will be the supreme test of Washington's law enforcement agencies. Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And I'm David Olusoga. And that article you read, Sarah, published 5 days before the March on Washington, I'm fascinated by that article. Just of the words that he used. The choice of words says so much about the way the press had wound up the tension leading up to the March on Washington, the great day when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And as we said in the last episode, we wanted to talk about the fact that no one knew it was going to be a great day at the beginning of 28th of August 1963. And looking at the press, look at those word choices swarming over this route. People fear that they will crush their way into the Capitol, that it will explode into violence. The words used in that article just really, I think, indicate that the expectations of many people were not of a great day and a great speech and a great protest, but of violence and chaos.
I mean, I think you're right. That word swarming is so telling, right? That Black people will be swarming like an infestation, but also that they say that the test of whether it sets back the cause of civil rights will be in the hands of the police, not in the hands of the civil rights activists themselves. It's up to the police to determine what's going to happen, when in fact, it was up to the 250,000 people who were coming to determine what was going to happen. And of course, from our point of view, when we talk about a protest march, we're hoping that large numbers will come out. But as you say, they were saying they fear it. And so all of those expectations are being set by the media, by the discourse at the time, that this is going to be a terrible event.
There's almost an implication that there's a certain number of Black people beyond which there is almost an inevitability of violence.
No, it's exactly like a critical mass and violence will happen. No, and I honestly believe that, when you read the way that American, history and popular culture, cultural discourse, the way that it talks about African Americans throughout its history, that was the expectation. There was this constant belief or fear that there would be an uprising, that a peaceful protest wasn't possible. Now, again, that's kind of revealing because it actually shows how much they were aware that there was stuff to rise up against, but that's another part of the story. So we left the activists last time getting into their cars, getting into their buses, and making their way to the Capitol.
That's right. The night of the 27th of August into the 28th of August is a story that really begins in darkness. There are just beautiful photographs of crowds of Black people gathering under the streetlights in prearranged pickup spots to get on buses to travel through the night to the Capitol. In New York, the volunteers of the Church World Service handed out thousands of packed lunches for the marchers, cheese sandwiches, an apple, and a slice of pound cake. I have no idea what pound cake is, by the way.
I had to exactly. Pound cake is delicious. I love pound cake. It's made with a pound. It's like made with a pound of butter and a pound of flour or something. Bakers will have to correct me, but it's something like that. But it's really, really nice.
I'll try it next time I'm in America.
Yeah, you should. If you like cake, it's a really nice one. But also we should remind listeners from last time that, of course, their cheese sandwiches did not have mayonnaise because they had been carefully instructed not to bring mayonnaise to a hot DC summer.
That's right. That night is an amazing night of mobilization. They weren't just mobilizing people, they were mobilizing money to help support the march and the civil rights movement. At the famous Apollo Theater in Harlem, there was a benefit show organized by the great civil rights activist Corinne Smith. Stevie Wonder played. The singers Tony Bennett and Quincy Jones performed. But the big story is that 2,200 specially chartered buses, those sort of beautiful 1960s sleek silver chrome buses, leave cities across the country All of this has been coordinated by unions, by the NAACP, by the great organizer of the march, Bayard Rustin, from his office in Washington. And the highways of the nation that night are these huge convoys of buses. Some of them are decorated with the names of the organizations that had saved their money, that had collected money to send people to the march. Churches, branches of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Some had been sent by unions. And on those buses, people are trying to get some sleep. There are just beautiful pictures of people curled up trying to sleep through the night. And you have to imagine what it is like to have left Philadelphia or Boston and to arrive in Washington at sunrise and to see the sunrise over the Potomac through the windows of those buses. There were some people who were coming from states where there were hardly any African-American people. There were more African-Americans on the march than there were in many states. We were talking about New Mexico in our previous editions. More black people at the march in Washington than live in New Mexico in 1963. The crowd itself, this spectacle of these thousands of buses, was breathtaking. People also are in their own cars. Some people are arriving by trains. 40 special trains had been put on. They're arriving at Washington's Union Station at regular 10-minute intervals. This is this great gathering of people for this protests in this terrible year of violence, but also a year of hope and belief that things can possibly change.
And they're gathering, aren't they, at actually what is an incredibly beautiful, I think, I'm American, of course, but I think it's an incredibly beautiful spot in the Capitol, the mall, where there is that mile-long stretch, which was described in the article I read, from that mile that stretches between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. And to get there as the sun is rising over those two great monuments, as you say, David, to hope, whatever you may think about the realities of what American political life has been, the hope is there. And those two great symbols are symbols of hope. And so we have these people gathering as the sun rises on the monuments, and the organizers are watching, right? Because they're hoping, speaking of hope, they're hoping that they're going to have a pretty good turnout. They're hoping to get a good turnout.
But they're still not confident.
So what was their target? What did they have? What were they hoping they could achieve?
Well, they had set themselves an informal target of 100,000 people turning up. And the sun rose on that day in Washington around 6:30 in the morning, and the National Mall was still empty. Now, what the organizers don't know is whether the buses that they had arranged for, the trains that had been specially chartered, whether people had actually got on them. There'd been so much in the press warning of violence, warning of arrests and trouble, that, maybe people had reacted to that media hysteria and decided it wasn't worth it. They don't know whether they're going to meet their target of 100,000. They don't know whether they're going to surpass it. There is a moment early in the morning when the mall is still empty, when the organizers are really concerned. John Lewis, who is the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he still thinks at that point, early in the morning of the march, that they'll be lucky if 75,000 people turn up.
That's not what happened, is it? As we know, people start gathering, and it built beyond 75,000 pretty quickly. John Lewis knew pretty quickly that they had exceeded his expectations.
Yeah. You had this strange effect that morning, was that the city was both full and empty. It was empty because 160,000 federal workers, for the most part, had decided to stay at home. So there was no traffic. It's a Wednesday morning, but it felt like a Sunday. The taxi drivers had given themselves the day off. The tourists hadn't bothered to come. There was half the level of normal occupation in the city's hotels. But then this mass of people started heading towards the Washington Monument, which was the start point of the march, from the stations, from the bus depots, from the pre-arranged places where the buses are going to park, all of it organized by the great organizer Bayard Rustin. And slowly, the National Mall fills up. It goes past 100,000, the target. Then it goes past 200,000. We don't know how many people turn up. Some people have looked at aerial photographs and they've come up with figures of 300, 400, 500,000 even. The figure most historians have settled on is 250,000 people.
They are, as we've been saying, also entering into a city with the police and, in fact, the army on red alert.
Yeah, they're arriving into a zone into which can be poured 6,000 policemen or 19,000 soldiers who are on standby in army bases and some of them in the suburbs. Now, it's really interesting, I think, to contrast the policing of the March on Washington in 1963 to another event that took place 2 years earlier, Kennedy's inauguration in 1961. Near to 1 million people came for the inauguration. The policing for the inauguration was tiny compared to the policing for the March of Washington. 1/4 of the number of people, a far, far bigger police force and a military contingent that was really unprecedented. And this is again about those perceptions that black people in large numbers made violence or disorder inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Of course, there were groups in America at that time, as now, who actually wanted violence to emerge. Their political position was that violence on that day would be a good thing.
Yeah. Both the organizers and also the Kennedy White House, for their different reasons, have been determined to do everything they could all that summer to make sure that there was no violence, there was no disorder. But there was one group who'd spent the exact same period trying to make sure that violence would erupt. And that was the American Nazi Party. And it was led by an infamous figure, George Lincoln Rockwell.
The American Nazi Party of the 20th century is actually a really important factor in American politics in several regards. And of course, you say it's strange that they were there. They're there because of the First Amendment, which allows for freedom of political organization and freedom of assemblage. So the American Nazi Party was constantly testing the First Amendment throughout the 20th century. Indeed, I remembered as a child, they tested it at various times. So George Lincoln Rockwell becomes this notorious figure. Now, it is worth saying, given the politics of the United States today, that the American Nazi Party at the time was very much seen as a fringe party, and Rockwell was very much seen as a fringe figure, but he got media attention, and he'd been giving talks that year. He'd been using the civil rights movement to, kind of launch his platform as well.
Yeah, he is using language which I think disturbingly is not entirely dissimilar to the language in mainstream newspapers to describe the march. He talked in a speech he gave in Virginia in July 1963 of a swarming black nightmare coming to the Capitol. The same word, swarm, that a respectable magazine like Life would use the same year. It's really disturbing how the language is used on the extreme is also being reflected in the mainstream press.
Okay, the Nazi part of the American Nazi Party was fringe, but unfortunately the white supremacism was not. That's why 250,000 people had to march on Washington, because they weren't being given their rights, because white supremacism was baked into so much of the country. We've got to remember when we talk about the civil rights movement, we are talking about a country that was segregated. We were talking about apartheid, where black people and white people, weren't using the same water fountains. Now, people know this, but it's easy to forget. And that wasn't just in the Deep South, that it was across the United States, what was called the color bar, which said that black people couldn't enter certain, restaurants or nightclubs or use certain hotels. You said a lot of the hotels in DC were empty. Well, on the night of the march. And that's because a lot of them wouldn't admit black people. So the black people who are coming for the march couldn't stay in some of those hotels. And it's the white people who are staying away, right? And so people like George Lincoln Rockwell saw an opportunity there, didn't they?
That's exactly right. He understood that, as you say, the Nazi part would turn some people off, but the white supremacist arguments that were central to his platform did have a huge hinterland. And so he spent the summer trying to persuade people to go to Washington to do what we would today call a counter demonstration, but really what he wanted was violence. In that same speech in Virginia in July, he called for what he called 100,000 grim-jawed white men to square in the path of the black swarm. Same word again, swarm. Rockwell and his party used to drive around America in their official hate bus. That's what they called it. It was a green Volkswagen camper van with the words hate bus written on it in big letters.
I just want to say that if you're literally getting into the hate bus, it's time to ask yourself some questions about your life choices. Like, don't get on the hate bus.
It's a moment to look yourself in the mirror that morning.
It's my first rule, David, is I'm not going to get on the hate bus, right? So, I mean, but
Should we get that on t-shirts?
Oh, God, stay off the hate bus. Yeah. But, we've been talking about the symbolism of it, but it is so blatant. It's so in your face. So here are these 250,000 peaceful protesters and everybody's saying, oh my God, they're going to bring violence. You've got a Nazi literally in a bus that says hate bus on it. And people are saying, ooh, the black people are creating violence.
That's exactly right. It's not subtle. And some of Rockwell's supporters did arrive in Washington on the 28th of August, the day of the march, but not 100,000 of them. Around 70 of them turned up. They were quickly intercepted by the police and taken off the streets.
70 full stop. Not 70,000, not 17, 70.
70.
So, which is quite pathetic and serves them right. And we can enjoy the comedy of that.
To talk about the way the march was organized, we've just been saying how everything about it was brilliantly organized. The idea was that everyone would gather around the Washington Monument, which is kind of in the middle of the National Mall, and they would walk down to the Lincoln Memorial. And the march would start at 11:30. But crowds have their own spirit. They have their own, way of thinking and organizing themselves. And the crowd assembled, 250,000 people, and they just spontaneously started marching. The organizers were, looking at this crowd, delighted with the size and the number of people who turned up. And suddenly they see them marching down Independence and Constitution Avenues towards the Lincoln Memorial before they were supposed to. But it creates this comic moment where Martin Luther King and John Lewis and the other leaders of the Big Six, the great African-American organizations, they had to rush to get into the march. And they can't get to the front of the march, which is where they're supposed to be. They're supposed to lead this march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. And they end up somewhere in the middle. And so if you look at those photographs of Martin Luther King and his supporters and the great leaders of Black America leading this march, they're actually somewhere in the middle. There's thousands of people ahead of them. It looks totally convincing on the press photographs, and you would never think it, but it is this kind of wonderful moment where things just took on a life of their own.
And it's like they were late for their own march, which is just kind of like they have to rush to catch up. It's actually like an anxiety dream, isn't it? It's probably what they were dreaming of the night before the march, is that they're going to be late for their own march. And then it happens. No, it is. It's so great. And it is nice, because it is such a beautiful day, but there is so much violence and fear and anxiety that goes into it. It is nice that there are these moments of comedy and, there's so much human comedy in this, despite the seriousness of the endeavor. And that's just one of the great, laughs of the story. It's them rushing to get in there.
So the crowds with King and the others somewhere in the middle reach their destination, which is the great Lincoln Memorial. A stage has been set up in front of the monument. And of course, as you all know, inside the monument is this giant statue of Lincoln sat on a throne looking out across Washington. Now, when we think of Martin Luther King and the leaders of the civil rights movement, we think about their kind of moral authority. I think what we sometimes forget is that they were really hard-nosed professional manipulators of public opinion. They understood that their cause was righteous, and they were determined to use everything they could, every device, pull every lever, press every button to try to hammer home their message and win support. They understood the power of images. So they understood that the shots of Lincoln behind the speakers was a great press photograph. They understood that the reverse image that the photographers would get of the speakers standing in front of this crowd stretching down to the Washington Monument past the reflecting pool, that was a great image. But they also understood that this was the 1960s and there was an enormous power in celebrity.
So these are some of the really famous pictures because of that power of celebrity, right? Some of the really famous pictures from the march are of the movie stars, the musicians who joined the march, both black and white, and who linked arms and walked together I am going to get choked up in parts of the story and picturing some of those images. I just got a little bit emotional because they are really moving, of them linking arms and showing that solidarity. And they were led by one of the great actor, singer, activists of the 20th century, who I'm a huge fan of, and I know you are too, David, Harry Belafonte.
Yeah, I've always longed to meet Harry Belafonte and never got the chance. He was basically the civil rights movement's man in LA. And he, in the weeks before the march, basically went round the mansions of the rich and famous. He went round the film studios. He got on the phone to agents and he drummed up support. He also had the help of Ossie Davis, the great African-American actor. And they organized what Belafonte called the cultural delegation. They even got a special plane chartered to take celebrities from New York and from Los Angeles to the Capitol for the March on Washington. And I mean, they do pretty good. The list of people, and go online and look at the photographs of the celebrities who turn up for the March on Washington. It's pretty astonishing. I mean, should we go through the list?
It's a roll call, right? Some of them maybe are not as famous today as they were at the time. They were absolutely huge. So for people who don't know these names, we're talking A-list celebrities. We're talking, Brad Pitt, George Clooney level of global fame at the time. Some of them were such huge stars that they are still iconic and legendary names, like Marlon Brando, for example. Judy Garland was there. Joan Baez was there. Paul Newman was there. Bob Dylan was there. Of course, Sammy Davis Jr., who himself was active activist. He was active and an activist.
And then some more surprising names as well, or maybe more surprising to us today. Burt Lancaster was there. Charlton Heston, two of the great actors of their age.
And Charlton Heston's a really interesting one, right? Because we spoke about him in the NRA episode. For a certain generation of Americans, he is infamous for having been, a kind of right-wing figurehead of the NRA. And yet he was a stalwart of the civil rights movement in the 60s. So the story of Charlton Heston is probably one that's worth telling as well. We also haven't mentioned, we've got Harry Belafonte, but of course the other great Black activist actor who was there was the other man that I would have loved to meet, Sidney Poitier.
Yeah, there were pictures of Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte together. And I mean, two people that good looking, I don't think should be allowed in the same room. I mean,
they should have been allowed to have children. Biology needed to be different so that those men could have children. They're the most beautiful people on the planet.
They're beautiful images. There's also the great African-American baseball player, Jackie Robinson, who kind of means something that as a British person, I will never fully understand, but he is a kind of legendary figure to Americans. The actor James Garner, who was on
Huge
TV
fan.
when I was a kid in the Rockford
James
Files. He was there. The great singer Lena Horne, another singer Bobby Darin was there.
Diane Carroll as well. Because we were talking about the ways in which the male leadership was dominating and women were being marginalized to a certain extent. But there were these very important women, particularly singers. So Diane Carroll, Lena Horne, Judy Garland. But the point is that these are people who were deeply engaged in the cause of civil rights and that women were there too. And it's really important that we remember that.
There are amazing pictures of these Hollywood and music stars, some of the most famous faces of their time, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, talking to civil rights leaders. What's really shocking about it is that we now know that at the last minute, the FBI tried to stop them from getting there. They phoned them in their hotels the night before. They told them that there was going to be violence and it wasn't safe to attend. So at the very last minute, understanding the power of celebrity to endorse and support the civil rights message, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI tried to stop it from happening at the last moment. But it didn't work. And they weren't just there, they were performing. Joan Baez began the day singing some of her great folk songs. Bob Dylan sang one of his songs, Only a Pawn in Their Game, which is about the life and murder of Medgar Evers. Burt Lancaster gave a speech on civil rights. And then something which just astonishes me, a figure who seems out of time to be there, was Josephine Baker. And she won't mean much to most people, but she was one of the most famous people in the world in the 1920s. She was arguably the most famous woman in the world in the 1920s. She was a young black dancer who left America, as many black performers did, and went to Paris. She took the nightclubs of Paris by storm. In the Second World War, she was a member of the French resistance. And at 57 years old, she left her home in Paris. She lived there since the 1920s, came to the March on Washington, and Josephine Baker gave a speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial.
And she was only 57, which is kind of crazy to think about. But as you say, she was a very young woman.
I think she was a teenager when she left. She was so young. So she was almost a child when she was on the stage in Paris in the 20s. Yeah. And so here she is in the 60s, still only 57. I mean, I'd love to do a couple of episodes on Josephine Baker because her life
so interesting.
Is the 1920s. It's the French resistance. She adopted loads of children. She's an astonishing figure.
Yeah, she's so interesting. We should definitely do Josephine Baker. Yeah. I'm all on board for that. And it will include her presence at the March on Washington. So we've already described a march that we can hear as a huge success. These performances are going. These speeches are being given. 250,000 people have in fact attended. It is peaceful. But all of these lovely speeches and songs are not the reason. It's not Burt Lancaster's speech that has gone down in history from the March on Washington.
And it says a lot, perhaps, that some of the most famous people in the world were there. And yet people are surprised when they hear that Burt Lancaster and Bob Dylan and Marlon Brando were at the March on Washington. And that is because of the power of the speeches that were to come after their performances.
One speech in particular, which we will talk about after the break. Join us then. So we've been leading up to an iconic moment in American history. The March on Washington is famous for speeches. Now, as we said, there is one speech in particular, which we will get to, Martin Luther King's great speech. But his was not the only speech of the day.
No, his was the 16th. A. Philip Randolph, the man who'd had the original idea for a March on Washington, he spoke. John Lewis, the 23-year-old civil rights leader, spoke. Daisy Prince and other civil rights organizers gave the tribute to African-American women and their role in civil rights. The Rabbi Joachim Prince also spoke. King was the last, but before talking about that speech, there's another detail about the precautions that the Kennedy White House had put in place that's important to understand. And I think when you understand this, it does reframe our understanding of the speeches, because the Kennedy administration were not just fearful of violence. It's too easy to say that for the best of interests, to allow for political pragmatism, they didn't want to see disorder on the streets. They also evidently wanted some sort of control of the words that would be uttered from the stage. And to give them that level of control, they had secretly installed what was called a kill switch, a button that, if pressed, would cut the power to the microphones of the speakers on the stage.
I mean, it's such an incredible thing to realize. This absolutely iconic speech that Dr. King is about to give might not have happened if some bureaucrat or soldier or whoever it was behind the scenes, we'll get to who was going to actually make the decision, was empowered to decide whether people were going to get to hear this. Now, there is supposed to be an amendment promising freedom of speech. There isn't supposed to be somebody in there cutting it off if they don't like what you're about to say.
Yeah. The guy at the center of this story is called Jerry Bruno. He worked for President Kennedy. He was what was called an advance man. That means he went ahead of wherever the president was going for public appearances, and he tried to work out the logistics. Jerry Bruno, in fact, had done the planning for the visit to Dallas in November 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. And he was traumatized by what had happened and traumatized by the fact that he had done the logistics. On the day of the march, Bruno was stationed near the control booth of the PA system. Now, the government had helped Bayard Rustin, the organizer, get access to the PA, and they'd used that assistance to install the kill switch. Now, Bruno had direct communication with the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and he was there to relay updates of what was happening at the march to Kennedy. And he was ordered to listen and, if necessary, to make the decision to cut the power to the microphones. And when you think about, and when you go and listen, and I really hope people do go and listen to the Dream speech, there's a finger hovering over a switch that could stop those words from being imprinted into history as they were on that day.
So what were they going to do if Kennedy did make the call and say, this is too radical, we're not having this? What was the plan if they actually flicked the kill switch?
Well, the kill switch turned off the microphones, but it didn't stop the PA from working. So their plan was that they were going to play gospel songs. They were going to try to use black people's music and kind of to pacify them almost. It's just bizarre. But the kill switch was never flicked. And so we did get to hear the Dream speech. But to understand that speech, and it is quite a surprising story, we have to go back a few days because, I mean, King, we all recognize that Martin Luther King was one of the great orators, one of the most articulate speakers of all time. But he worked really hard on those speeches. He had the ability to move crowds, but he also put in a lot of work. And he worked very hard on the days leading up to the march on his speech. And two of his assistants, Clarence Jones and Stanley Levinson, also worked on early drafts, trying to introduce new ideas, trying to fine-tune it. And we know that King was up. His wife, Coretta Scott King, tells us that he stayed up late the night before trying to make the speech perfect. When the organizers were trying to work out the order of who was going to speak, there's a story I've always loved because a lot of these civil rights leaders, they're big personalities. I mean, this is not a place without ego. And the debate was what the running order should be. Who should speak first? Who should speak last? And in the middle of this debate, in some versions of this story, it is John Lewis, I'm not quite sure who it was, makes a really important point. They say, who wants to speak after Martin Luther King? Who really wants to be the follow-up act to Martin Luther King? I mean, literally, we use the cliche, try and follow that. So it was very quickly decided that King would speak last because no one wants to try to speak after him.
I mean, and they're not wrong, right? Let him go last, give greatness its due. And before King took the stage, there was some singing. It wasn't the kill switch singing, but we did have some singing there as well.
Yeah, the great gospel singer Mahalia Jackson sang I've Been Buked and I've Been Scorned, one of her great songs. It is just beautiful. King had asked her to speak. They were close friends. Because he was the last speaker, there was another kind of advantage to going last, which is that everybody else had to try to stick to time because it was so carefully choreographed. Before King went onto the podium, Bayard Rustin, the organizer, reminded him, you're the last speaker. If you want to take a few extra minutes, take a few extra minutes. No one's following you. King, knowing that he could, if he wanted to, do something extra, is what made this such an historic speech. But to Americans, the symbolism of what he said and the symbolism of where he was standing is kind of maybe more obvious to people who aren't from the United States. He's standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, but he's also paraphrasing, Sarah, Lincoln's words, isn't he, in the first part of the speech?
Yeah, he absolutely is. So, the symbolism, as you say, is kind of overwhelming for Americans on many levels. I mean, first of all, now when we look at King in front of the Lincoln Memorial, we're looking at two of our greatest civil rights leaders, both of whom were assassinated. And of course, this is 5 years before King's murder. But then the symbolism was still incredibly powerful because what King does is, and the thing is you need to know, as you do, David, that at the Lincoln Memorial is encircled with some of Lincoln's words from his great second inaugural, which is when he talks about the better angels of our nature during the Civil War, hoping that the better angels of our nature will rise up and that, we will be our best selves rather than our worst selves.
One of the great speeches of the 19th century.
One of the greatest speeches in American history. But the other words that are in the Lincoln Memorial are from the Gettysburg Address. And we were talking last time about how 1963 was chosen symbolically because it was a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was also a century after the Gettysburg Address. You were talking last time, David, about how they saw the unfinished promise of freedom from the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Gettysburg Address also makes the same promise. Twice in 1863, Lincoln makes the promise, first with emancipation and then with this great speech at Gettysburg, in which he says that the reason that the Civil War is being fought is to achieve full freedom for the whole nation. And what he says in the Gettysburg Address, and I am just going to quote a few words of it, he says, "The nation must be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom." That's the promise that Lincoln makes in 1863 in the Gettysburg Address. And now some of the early part of the Gettysburg Address, as I say, is etched into the memorial. And then Martin Luther King stands up in front of it. And he, if this isn't too lighthearted a word, to me it isn't, he riffs on Lincoln in this speech, and he picks up the Gettysburg Address and he brings it into 1963. And he says, there is a promise that has not been kept.
Yeah. He begins using the idea of a score, the word for 20 years. He says 50 years ago, and Lincoln had begun using the same device at Gettysburg.
7 years ago. Exactly. Our fathers brought forth on this nation. So some of us can do, I was actually taught to recite the Gettysburg Address. I can delight our listeners with that if they'd like me to go through the whole thing.
But every American, as you've just proved, would have understood immediately when King began 50 years ago that it was a back reference to the Gettysburg Address. But then, as you say, he picks up this idea of what he calls the promissory note. He's saying that America made a promise in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation to its African-American citizens, that it had promised freedom, not just the end of slavery, but something more meaningful. And then King says, instead of honoring that sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. The check's bounced. That promise, demonstrably, 100 years of Jim Crow and lynching and the KKK, that check has not been honored. And he says, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. It's an incredibly powerful kind of metaphor. It speaks to Lincoln. It speaks to American history. It speaks to the date, 1963 and 1863. It's astonishing.
The threading of it is incredible, of the rhetoric and the metaphor, because to say the American dream is partly a dream of economic promise. And then he takes that, and instead of talking about getting rich, he makes it a moral promise and says it's about, are we morally bankrupt? Are we actually going to live up to our promises? So the kind of the metaphorical turn there, I could go on. What he does is extraordinary with the language. And so he says, we've come, it's such an American thing to say this is about a check, but he comes and he says, we've come to cash this check.
Yeah. This is the eloquence of the speech that King had sat down and wrote and rewrote and refined day after day leading up to the march. And it is, as you say, it is beautiful and eloquent, astonishingly powerful, rooted in American history and American philosophy. At the end of the 7th paragraph, though, there was a kind of natural pause. And it's at this moment that kind of something really magical happens. Mahalia Jackson, King's friend, who had just sung one of her great gospel songs, she shouts out to her friend Martin Luther King, tell him about the dream, Martin. Now, not many people heard her. Ted Kennedy later said that he heard it. But the key thing is that King heard it. And at that moment, he does something truly astonishing. And remember where he is. He's standing in front of 250,000 people. There are an estimated 500 cameras pointing at him. His words are being broadcast live across the nation and across the world. And at that moment, in that context, in that situation, facing that crowd, he decides to do something remarkable. He decides to improvise. He departs from the beautiful words that he's worked so hard on the piece of paper in front of him, and he decides to wing it, to try something out. I have improvised a few times in front of tiny audiences, and it's terrified me.
You know, she gives him the image, and he knows what she's referring to because this is
he knows
something
exactly what she's saying
that he has spoken about before.
Yeah. They are friends, Mahalia Jackson and King, and she has heard his speeches before and repeatedly. And lots of great historians have kind of gone through the texts of all of King's speeches to see the genealogy of these metaphors and these ideas and these phrases. Many times in the preceding couple of years, once in Chicago, once in Detroit, he'd used this idea of the dream. At this point in the early 60s, Martin Luther King is giving a speech almost every day. This is his superpower. He has this ability to recall phrases and ideas from earlier speeches and to kind of edit in and out of them. Clarence Jones, who helped King write the great speech on the March on Washington, he's described it in one of his books as a bit like cut and paste. You know, you can't see the edits in a cut and paste on something you write on a computer. So he was able to recall these passages and just drop them in, go into this improvised sequence and go back at the end of it, go back to the prepared text.
It is incredible, as you say, because the polish of the speech seems so perfect. That man doesn't or ah like normal people. And yet, as we've been saying, it's also the complexity of it, that he's weaving together all of these histories and strands and these pieces of American discourse and history and the Bible, of course, too, and this sense of a promise. And he comes together and he says, so there's been this American dream and I have a dream too. And it's that the promise of freedom will be kept, right?
I defy people to actually listen to this speech and not feel emotions in these 5 paragraphs. I mean, the most famous passage is probably about when he speaks about his own children. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It's overwhelmingly emotionally powerful. The images, the idea of the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, these images, the table of brotherhood, these images they're just so powerful. Years ago, in my late 20s, I was a young producer at the BBC, and I was making a program about Black history, about civil rights, the sort of stuff I've spent my career doing. And in those days, we'd just gone digital, but most of the BBC archive was on records. It was on gramophones. And I was working very late at night. It was about midnight. I was trying to record these analog discs onto a digital tape so I could use it in my program. And I was busy doing my other stuff. And I put the dream speech on the record player, pressed play to record it, to digitize it. And I thought I'd just go about my work. And it got to this section and I found myself just weeping. And I think it's because I hadn't prepared myself to listen to it. I'd imagined it was going to be like background noise and I'd be doing something else. And I just sat there and cried for about half an hour because of those words. That effect has been spoken about by millions of people who've come across this speech, whether they're kids at school. And, you know, you look at the photographs, people at the time hearing this live, those lucky 250,000 people who were there on the day in front of King, you can see in their faces that those words, those 5 paragraphs had an effect that is, you know, it's once in a lifetime, once in a generation that a speech can do that.
Yeah. It's a speech that spoke to everyone around the world. It is specific to American contexts, but it is about universal human dreams, about justice and about equality and about freedom. And it's about, as we've been saying, it's also that human desire to live up to your promises. And there's something very moving about that too, of saying, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Well, that's about humans standing up and living up to, again, to use Lincoln's words, the better angels of our nature, to be our best selves, to live as fully as we know that we can, and to live compassionately and with justice and freedom for others and not just for ourselves. So it is a very American moment, and it's a very American political context that, you know, King is reacting to, as we're saying, responding to, and that's part of what makes it so powerful. But he's drawing on these very, very human and universal ideas, and some of the language too. We've been talking about how American it is, but as we say, it's also biblical, right? So there are these other themes, and he was so well read. He's pulling on all kinds of
this
ideas.
is the son of a Baptist preacher. He is not short of biblical imagery. When you learn that that was improvised, I think it just makes it even more astonishing. And really from the moment he got off stage, people did begin to realize that that speech had been special, that that had been something of a different order to the other very fine speeches given that day. But I think its true power wasn't immediately obvious. And because the march had been so well organized, and because so many predictions of violence and chaos had been made in the days before, what happened when he got off stage was very carefully planned. There was some final remarks by Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. They thanked the audience. They listed some of their demands. And as people left the National Mall, they left their placards. They said things like, "We march for jobs for all now. We demand voting rights now, an end to segregated rules in public schools." But Bayard Rustin had been determined to get people out of Washington really efficiently, because he feared that if there was a chance for violence to erupt, for the crowd to be attacked, it was as they were leaving. All of the fears of violence and disorder had been proved to be unfounded. 3 people had been arrested, and they'd all been white. And now Kennedy, who'd been watching every word of this from the White House, is willing to give the March on Washington his stamp of approval.
He wants to get in on the action, does he? It's been a success. So there comes the politician ready for the photo op.
Exactly. So the limousines arrive. The leaders of the big 6 African-American organizations, King, Rustin, John Lewis, the rest of them, are ushered to the White House. And there they have a meeting with Kennedy. They try to urge him to make the civil rights bill that he is drafting a bit more radical.
But it isn't just the pressure coming from the people who were present at the march, isn't it? It's very clear very quickly that something phenomenal has happened.
Something phenomenal had happened at the National Mall that day, but it had also happened all around the world. There had been more television cameras for the March on Washington than there had been 2 years earlier for the inauguration of President Kennedy. ABC and NBC, 2 of the big 3 networks, had cut away from their scheduled program to broadcast the Dream speech live. The events of the day were then rebroadcast during the evening news. The Nielsen company that does the viewing figures, the ratings, as we call them in the UK, reported a 50% increase in TV viewership. But the other thing is that this was a global television event. We mentioned in the last episode that one of the things that made the violence of 1963 so difficult for America and for the Kennedy administration is that it was televised all over the world. And that had been because of new communication satellites launched the year before. Those same satellites now took King's words around the world. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people heard what he had said from the Lincoln Memorial that day.
Not everyone watching would have wanted America to come out well from this. They wouldn't have wanted it to end peacefully. In fact, the New York Times was saying that America's enemies, particularly, of course, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, would hope that it would go wrong so that they could broadcast American capitalism running amok.
Yeah, the Soviets were broadcasting it live in the hope that there was violence. So not that it went well. They must have been really disappointed by it. A bit like the American Nazi Party.
Yeah, exactly. It was the hate bus was running out of gas.
Rockwell and Khrushchev were the only people unhappy.
Exactly. Well, and we think of 1963 as a time when, the kind of TV was, I don't know, like I want to say flat, like it wasn't very interactive. But in fact, they had follow-up TV in a way that feels very modern, very 21st century. There was they had panels coming together to talk about what had just happened on TV to keep the story going.
Yeah, there is an amazing program on TV in America on the night of the 28th of August, 1963. And I sent you it a few weeks ago.
It's incredible.
Hollywood Roundtable. This was a discussion show that was broadcast that evening. And I'll just read the guest list. Marlon Brando, James Baldwin, Harry Belafonte, Charlton Heston, Sidney Poitier, and the film director, Joseph Menkovich, gathered in a studio to discuss the desperate need for civil rights in America. I mean, it is your fantasy dinner party guest list. I mean, I wish they'd invited Josephine Baker and Ella Baker as well.
Yeah,
I would have loved
indeed.
to hear what Josephine Baker had said. But, I sent you the clip a few weeks ago. It's astonishing.
It is astonishing. And it's it's on YouTube. Everybody should watch it.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Hollywood Roundtable.
Yeah, Hollywood Roundtable with those. But it would have been good if Josephine Baker and Rosa Parks were there, because it is a fantastic dinner party with no women. It is what we today call a manel in the trade. But if you're going to have a manel, that was a good manel with Marlon Brando, Poitier, Belafonte, and James Baldwin. One of the things that's amazing about it is that they are all on the same side, but they are disagreeing about very, very courteously, but they are disagreeing in important ways about what needs to happen and why. And so there is this really wonderful, very genuine debate happening from people all on the same side of the political fence. They're all very pro-civil rights, but they're still having this very interesting debate. It's an amazing bit of archive where, Brando talks about how he was converted to civil rights. Charlton Heston has this amazing kind of confession where he says that until recently, he says, I have to admit, my civil rights were limited to cocktail parties. And then I realized that something really important was happening and that I needed to do better. It's extraordinary.
That's an amazing bit, isn't it? It's such an admission. It's an incredible thing that he says.
Yeah. And Poitier and Belafonte are both so moving and powerful because they come in and there is the anger in their voices. They're being courteous, but the anger is there. And Baldwin kicks it off. Actually, all three of them. They say, the white moderator says to them, how did you come to civil rights? And each of them says quite clearly, as a black man, I had to survive. Each of them in a slightly different way says, Baldwin says, because I'm a black man in America. That's how, what do you think? So they manage not to laugh in the moderator's face, but they're basically but there's anger, very discernibly under the surface, just kept under the surface of what they're saying. Of course, we have no choice but to be engaged in civil rights. So yeah.
I'm so glad you liked it.
Oh, it's amazing. I'm so glad you sent it to me. I can't believe I'd never seen it.
It is hard to believe that it happened, that they were all brought together. And it's so 60s. I mean, James Baldwin must smoke 20 cigarettes through the course.
They're all in a tie.
And they all look so elegant. It's those little 60s suits and everything sort of neat and slim. It's beautiful.
To our listeners, obviously the first thing that you have to listen to after this podcast, if you haven't, or even if you have, is Martin Luther King's great I Have a Dream speech. But the second thing you should do is go to YouTube and look up this archive. It's 30 minutes and it's amazing.
We discussed earlier all of the extreme precautions that the Kennedy administration had put in place and the justification that they must have made to themselves for putting the police on standby, having the National Guard and the army ready to rush into DC if there was violence, was that any violence or even any provocative speeches, what they would regard as provocative, from the stage that day would undermine the attempts to pass through Congress a new civil rights bill. Well, because the march was such a success, because the dream speech was so incredibly powerful, it actually helped building up the momentum towards that law being passed. But the problem is it's just nowhere near that simple. It would be so nice to say America heard King's words and the nation was changed.
We saw the light.
Yeah, it would be so nice to say that. And there's a real danger that we tell this incredible story about this amazing event, about this astonishing speech, and that we talk ourselves into believing that it changed more than it really did.
The organizers were well aware of the risks that they were running, weren't they? I mean, we've been talking about how it was a year of tremendous racist violence. So, they have this peaceful protest. It's exceeded their expectations, but they're under no illusions that violence is going to disappear because King made a great speech.
The organizers of the march from early on had wanted to ensure that the moment it was over, that the crowds dispersed and got out of DC as quickly as possible. And that's because they were worried that there would be violence, not from their supporters, but that they would be attacked the way civil rights campaigners had been attacked repeatedly throughout 1963, repeatedly throughout the preceding decades of the civil rights struggle. And they were right. 6 of the buses carrying people home from Washington were attacked. Their windows were broken by stones thrown by crowds. One bus heading back to Philadelphia had its window broken by a bullet fired into the bus. And 2 of the marchers got home to the state of Mississippi. They went for breakfast. It was early in the morning. They'd been on the bus all night. And these 2 black marchers were dragged outside the diner by a white mob, and they were beaten in front of Mississippi police officers who witnessed the whole event and did nothing.
And actually, some of the worst violence of the civil rights era took place in the immediate aftermath of the peaceful March on Washington.
It did, and this is why we have to be cautious that this is such a powerful and emotive event. But 2 weeks after the March on Washington, 2 weeks after the I Have a Dream speech, a church on 16th Street in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed by the KKK, and 4 African-American girls, 14 years old, 11 years old in one case, were killed. Martin Luther King, who saw a lot of violence, even he was shocked by the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing.
Well, and in fact, there was also a predictable backlash, wasn't there? So we can talk about this as a time of the nation coming together, but politically, that isn't what happened either. Kennedy's photo op didn't necessarily help him.
No, the weeks after Kennedy had endorsed the march, his poll ratings dipped, not just in the South, but also in the North. Later in the year, Robert Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General, admitted that support for civil rights was damaging his brother's chances of winning the 1964 election. Of course, he never stood in that election because he was assassinated in November 1963. So we have to be really careful not to get carried away by the power of images, the power of the words of that day. We also have to remember that King doesn't occupy the position that he does today in the minds of people living in 1963. He was repeatedly one of the most hated men in America. He isn't elevated to the position of near sainthood that we hold him in today. And after the March on Washington, he became even more popular because he began to give speeches and to campaign not just for civil rights, but against poverty and against the war in Vietnam.
And that made him very unpopular with certain segments of mainstream white America, and not just mainstream white America. But I mean, the point is, it wasn't just fringe extremists who objected to King's politics by that point. And he became an increasingly divisive figure. As you say, we now see him as this, a lot of people treat him as this kind of sanctified figure, but he was martyred. Is important. That's partly where the sainthood comes from, is you have to be martyred to become a saint. And yeah, the point is that he was seen as dangerous enough, and the racial and political violence of America was real enough that all of this, of course, culminates in King's murder in 1968.
It does, and writing this and talking about it with you now, it's made me think about the episodes we did about the NRA and America's relationship with violence. Because, of course, 2 of the central figures in this story are assassinated. Kennedy is killed in November 1963, and King, of course, is assassinated in 1968.
And Robert Kennedy, too, in 68.
There's a strong argument that the Civil Rights Bill that was passed, that did become a Civil Rights Act in 1965, might not have been passed had JFK not been assassinated. When his successor, President Johnson, pushed it through Congress, he said it was a fitting tribute to the slain president. And King's reputation, and also the reputation of the I Have a Dream speech, didn't have that standing. He didn't have that standing. His words didn't have that standing until after he was assassinated. It was his murder that made his eloquence obvious and his speech legendary. So it does link very much to the story of the gun and the bullet that we were telling in previous episodes.
It does. And it was also the fact that his murder made him safe. He was politically getting less moderate, and he was politically getting more radicalized as the years went on.
And becoming less popular amongst mainstream America as a result. The majority of Americans regarded him unfavorably by the time of his assassination.
Yeah. So the legacy of the speech today, though, is undeniable. It is iconic in the ways we've been saying, but we were talking about the ways in which King was kind of reusing and revising older American traditions, particularly Lincoln. But now King's speech has been one that political leaders take forward.
Exactly. He was paraphrasing Lincoln. He was using political language from the 19th century to make a point in the 20th century. Well, in the 21st century, American politicians use King in exactly the same way. When Barack Obama first ran for power, he used one of the phrases that comes directly from the I Have a Dream speech. He borrowed the phrase, the fierce urgency of now. And Obama has often used phrases that were coined by Martin Luther King. I interviewed Obama back in 2020, and in that interview, he used another of King's most famous, most beloved phrases. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So he has become like Lincoln, the man whose image he spoke in front of at the March on Washington, a man whose words have become part of the idea of America, or I should probably say the ideals of America.
Look, I am so glad you wanted to do the March on Washington. And, we've been talking about the, some of the more depressing and despairing aspects of this, but there's so much hope in it, and there's so much uplift, and there's so much inspiration to be found in the story, in the speech itself, and in the story of the March on Washington. So you lifted my spirits, David. I hope it has lifted our listeners as well. And thanks very much for this today. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you for listening.
See you next time.